Long before the written word, before kingdoms and crowns, before even the whisper of history, there were battles. Brutal, raw, and silent to time. In the shadows of mammoths and saber-toothed predators, early humans turned on each other. Not for glory, not for conquest, but for survival. What sparked such primal violence? What did a real prehistoric battle actually look like? Who fought? And who fell? What secrets lie buried beneath the soil, lost in stone and bone? Let's find out. 1. When survival meant war. In the cold cradle of a fading ice age, two tribes stood on the edge of desperation. Food was vanishing. The forests had thinned. Mammoth herds had moved farther and farther north. One tribe, scarred by hunger, wandered into the hunting grounds of another. What followed wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was inevitable. There were no banners, no declarations, only the deep grunts of scouts returning to camp with urgent breath. They had seen strangers, men painted in red ochre, carrying spears with flints so sharp it could gut a deer in one stroke. The elders whispered warnings, recalling tales of raiders from the south who slit throats in the dark and vanished like ghosts. But this wasn't the south. This was home. The chieftain, a towering man with a cracked tooth and a boar tusk around his neck, gathered the hunters. Their weapons were crude but deadly, clubs shaped from jawbone, spears hardened in fire, nets woven from sinew and bark. Children and women were sent into caves. Fires were doused. Silence fell. The enemy came at dawn. There were no words, just the war cry of a young fighter whose brother had died last winter and whose eyes now blazed with fury. Spears flew like birds of death. The first to fall was an old man, struck through the chest. His blood steamed against the frost. This was not just survival now, it was vengeance. 2. The spark that lit the first flame. The battle was not born that morning. It had been smoldering for moons. Tracks had been found near the riverbed, traps had been sabotaged, and a pile of stripped bones, human bones, was discovered near a ravaged elk carcass. The signs were there, but fear makes men doubt their instincts. It started with a theft. One side had found firestone, rare and sacred. When the rival tribe came under cover of night and took it, the theft wasn't just of tools, it was of power. Fire meant life. It meant warmth, protection, cooking, and belief. Some said the stones were gifts from sky spirits, and those who held them were chosen. So when the theft was discovered, it wasn't discussed, it was avenged. Two brothers tracked the thieves by starlight. They followed broken twigs, crushed moss, and faint footprints left in thawing ground. For 3 nights they stalked, eating dried meat and whispering plans. And then, just before the 4th sunrise, they struck. The camp was small, a few huts made of mammoth hide and mud. A woman screamed as the first spear struck her mate. A child ran into the woods. The firestone was reclaimed, but at a cost. One brother never returned. His body was never found. The survivors knew this wasn't over. They had poked the bear. Now it would come snarling. 3. The gathering of the clans. When blood spilled in the old world, it called other. Far beyond the rivers and frostbitten hills, drums were beaten. Not drums of music, but of summoning. Clans that had once shared salt, meat, and stories, now stared at each other with narrowed eyes. The loss of the firestone, the midnight raid, and the burning of hunting shelters. These were not forgotten. Messages were not carved or written. They were spoken, passed from one hunter to another, from cave to trail to fire pit. A cry for vengeance, a call to arms. The clans would gather. Under the shadow of a dead tree, twisted by lightning and worshipped by both sides, leaders met. There was no peace to be made. Only oaths are to be sworn. Flint was sharpened, bones were carved into blades, sinew was stretched into bowstrings, and feathers were tied to arrows. It was there that the oath was spoken in guttural tones and cracking voices. We end this with blood or with bone. No more raids, no more running. The war would not be fought in secret anymore. It would be open and final. The hunters painted their bodies, symbols of death, of beasts, of ancestors long gone. Teeth were tied into braids. Skulls were placed at the edges of the camp, warning spirits and enemies alike. Every man, woman, and child knew. When the sun next rose, it might not set on all of them. 4. Weapons of bone, stone, and fury. There were no iron swords, no bronze shields, only what the earth gave and what it took back in blood. Flint, obsidian, sharpened bone, and fire-hardened wood. These were the tools of prehistoric war. Each weapon wasn't just forged for battle. It carried carried the soul of the one who made it. A spear carved by a father, passed down to his son, still stained with the blood of past hunts. A club made from a mammoth femur, wrapped in dried gut for grip, capable of shattering skulls. Men spent the night before the battle, hunched over fires, sharpening, whispering, and praying, not to gods, but to the ancestors who walked the wind. The women too prepared. Not all fought, but many did. Some carried slings, others bore knives chipped from volcanic stone. Those who stayed behind wrapped the warriors in furs, painted their faces, and tied lucky charms into their hair. The warriors did not eat. They fasted, their stomachs empty, their bodies lean. Hunger was a weapon, rage was fuel. When dawn broke, both tribes stood on opposite sides of a clearing, once a hunting ground, now an altar. There were no war horns, just silence, heavy as stone, broken only by the wind rustling through bone trees and the crackle of nervous breathing. And then the first warrior screamed, not in fear, but in fury. The others followed, voices rising like wolves under a blood moon. They charged, not for conquest, but for memory, for loss, for the names of the fallen etched only in the mind, and the earth would remember the echoes. The battle began not with precision, but with chaos. Spears soared, missing their marks, clubs cracked ribs, knives met flesh. Dust rose, blood sprayed, and the forest trembled. The first to fall was a boy barely into manhood, struck down by a woman with twin blades and a roar like thunder. Another was trampled as two warriors wrestled in the dirt, snarling like beasts. Arrows flew from the tree line, some finding targets, others vanishing into bark and bone. Above them, the sky seemed to watch. Clouds thickened, turning gold and gray. The tribes believed the sky gods judged warriors in battle, deciding who rose to the stars and who was swallowed by the earth. One warrior, called Kor, fought like a storm. Naked but for a bear hide across his back, he swung a mace made from river stone, snapping spines and splitting limbs. But even Kor could bleed. A dart found his thigh and he fell to one knee, and still he fought on. Screams filled the air of pain, rage, and desperation, but no one begged, not in this world. Death was not feared, it was joined like a brother long separated. The center of the field became a graveyard before the battle was even done. Limbs twisted, faces shattered, eyes wide with disbelief, and in the trees, younger ones watched, children who would carry this day in their dreams and who would grow with revenge carved into their bones. Every battle has a turning point. This one came when the Mammoth King fell. That was not his real name, but the name whispered by enemies who feared him. He was the chieftain of the northern tribe, massive, broad as two men, his chest covered in tattoos that told the story of 100 kills. He wore a mammoth skull as a helmet, tusks curling like blades. His presence alone was enough to freeze the hearts of lesser fighters. He waded through the battlefield like a god of war. Each swing of his axe, a chunk of obsidian wedged into wood, cleaved men apart. He fought not like a man, but like the beast whose bones crowned his head. But even giants bleed. A trap had been laid, simple, old, but deadly. A pit covered with leaves and branches just beyond the line of battle. The Mammoth King stepped back to finish off a wounded foe and fell. The ground gave way, down he plunged, legs snapping, ribcage cracking on stakes placed there by desperate hands. His scream shook the air. Warriors rushed to pull him free, but arrows rained down. His foes had seen their chance. The giant was wounded, the beast had fallen, and now the tide turned. The Mammoth King's death did not end the battle. It gave it new fire. His men, once unbeatable, now fought with terror in their eyes. The enemy surged, emboldened by the fall of a legend. Blood soaked the earth. In the sky, dark now, watched in silence. The forest was still, but not from peace. Where once there were screams, now there was only the crackle of dying fires and the moans of the wounded. The battlefield, once alive with fury, was a ruin of mangled bodies and shattered tools. Spears stuck upright from the ground like grave markers. The dirt was dark with blood. A vulture circled above, the first of many. Smoke hung low over the clearing, not just from the torches, but from the burning shelters nearby. In the chaos, someone had set fire to the outer edges of the enemy camp, hoping to force a retreat. But fire doesn't listen. It consumed tents, weapons, and meat stores, and it left behind only ash and embers. The victors didn't cheer. They limped. Some wept. Others sat beside the fallen, painting their faces with the blood of their kin, whispering promises of remembrance. There were no prisoners. The Stone Age did not permit mercy. The fallen were either kin or forgotten. A boy, no older than 10, stood barefoot among the corpses. In his hand, he held a dagger too large for his grip. He had not fought, but he had watched, and what he saw would stay with him, not as a tale, but as a hunger. High above, Thunder rumbled. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then hard. It washed away the footprints, the blood, the fire, but it could not wash away what had been done. The forest remembered, and the clans, they would not forget. Centuries passed, then millennia. The tribes vanished, their names lost, their language swallowed by time, but the bones remained in a windswept field where nothing but moss and lichen grow. Archaeologists in our time unearthed the site. Shards of weapons, fragments of skulls, and teeth marked by stone blades. They called it a massacre site, but they were wrong. It was a memory, a monument, a warning, carved not in words, but in wounds. Buried deep in the soil, they found the tusk helmet of the Mammoth King, split, burned, a relic of a man who was more myth than mortal. Nearby, the obsidian dagger of the boy who had once stood alone. It was found driven into a femur, as if in final defiance. This was no myth. It happened. What was once dismissed as tribal skirmishes were wars of survival, identity, and fire. Each artifact whispered truths that even before cities, even before gods, mankind knew how to hate and how to remember. But the question remains, what did they fight for in the end? Was it territory, revenge, or was it something deeper? The eternal struggle to matter, to endure, to be remembered even as the world forgets. And in that silent field, surrounded by bones and broken stone, maybe they were. What happened in that prehistoric battle wasn't just survival. It was a story of fire, blood, and memory. A story carved in silence, but screaming through time. Subscribe if you want more truths buried in the bones of history, and leave a comment. What would you have done if you stood in that clearing? Want to discover more about Stone Age life? From hunting techniques to ancient tools, there's so much more to explore about how our ancestors survived and thrived. Subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the Stone Age.